The night a king trades his queen for his crown, he doesn't lose power. He loses the one person who would have died protecting it. She knelt, she bled, she disappeared into the frozen dark carrying everything he threw away, and the world called it weakness. But weakness doesn't survive a wilderness winter alone. Weakness doesn't build an empire from nothing. Weakness doesn't make kings tremble at the sound of a name. Watch until the end. Drop your city in the comments. Because the woman they buried in exile? She came back wearing a crown sharper than any blade that ever touched her. Quotes. The Great Hall of Ashenvale Palace had been built to make men feel small. That was the point of it. King Aldrich the Conqueror had commissioned ceilings high enough to swallow torch smoke before it reached the rafters. Columns of pale stone hauled from the northern quarries at the cost of 600 lives, and floors polished so clean that every footstep echoed like a judgment. Standing inside it was meant to remind you of your own insignificance, meant to press you down with the accumulated weight of every ancestor who had ever knelt on those floors. Luna Seraphine had walked those floors 1,000 times without flinching. Tonight, kneeling on them, she finally understood what they were designed to do. The cold came up through the stone and into her knees first, then her palms, where she had braced herself against the floor after the guard's shove sent her down hard enough to crack bone against marble. Her fingers were bleeding. She hadn't noticed until the blood made the floor slippery beneath her right hand, dark red spreading slow against white stone, and she pressed harder to keep from sliding. Around her, the court watched in silence. Not the silence of grief, not the silence of shock, the silence of people who had already decided what they believed and were simply waiting for the ceremony of it to be finished. King Draven stood at the far end of the hall, elevated on the dais his father had built and his grandfather had bled for. He was wearing his formal armor, the black plate etched with the howling wolf crest that had defined the Ashenvale line for 6 generations. He looked magnificent. He had always looked magnificent. That had been the first thing she noticed about him years ago on a battlefield where they'd met not as enemies but as two people trying to stop a war neither of them had started. The jaw like carved stone, the gray eyes that saw through pretense, the way he moved through a room as though the room had been arranged specifically for him, not because he believed it had, but because he understood exactly how space worked and how to use it. She had loved that about him. She had loved him the way a person loves something they believe is permanent, the way you love the mountains, not carefully, not with any part of your mind that calculated the possibility of loss. He was not looking at her now. He was looking at Lady Veressa. Veressa stood to his right on the dais, close enough that the hem of her silver gown brushed his boot. She was beautiful in the way that expensive things were beautiful, all precision and intention, every feature arranged to maximum effect. Her dark hair had been dressed with white flowers that shouldn't have survived the winter, but had been grown in heated greenhouse chambers at considerable cost. The flowers were a message. Everything about Veressa was a message. She had been sending Seraphine messages for 2 years, subtle things, a look across a council chamber, a hand placed slightly too long on Draven's arm, a comment made in a crowded corridor that landed just precisely enough to sting and just ambiguously enough to deny. Seraphine had underestimated how fluent she was in that particular language. "You are brought before this court," said Lord Chancellor Ivric, reading from the scroll in his hands with the flat affect of a man who had rehearsed this enough times to evacuate any feeling from it, "under the charge of conduct unbecoming the office of Luna, of weakness demonstrated in public crisis, of failing the sacred duty of protection owed to the crown and its sovereign." Seraphine's jaw tightened. Weakness. 3 nights ago, someone had tried to kill her. Not metaphorically, not politically. A man had come through the window of her private chamber in the deep dark of the 3rd hour with a knife in each hand and the kind of focus in his eyes that meant he had done this before and intended to do it cleanly. She had been sleeping. She had not been wearing her guard ring, the enchanted band that would have summoned the palace watch instantly. It had been on the table beside the bed, 7 inches from her hand. She had killed him herself. Bare hands, no weapon, 8 months pregnant, and she had killed a trained assassin in her own bedroom because the alternative was dying, and she had absolutely no intention of dying. The guard captain who found her afterward had gone pale at the scene. Not at her. At what she had done to the man who came for her, Because survival, when it is raw and cornered and fighting for two lives instead of one, is not clean. It is not quiet. It does not look like the kind of thing they sang about in the Great Hall on feast nights. They had used the scene as evidence against her. The blood on her hands, literally the blood of a man who had tried to murder her, had been presented in this court as proof of something violent inside her, something unstable, something that made her unfit. She had not been permitted to speak in her own defense. She had been told that was not how this proceeding worked. The charges have been reviewed by the Royal Council, Feare continued, and found to have merit, in accordance with the sovereign's judgment. In accordance with whose judgment? Seraphine said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. Good. She had always been grateful for the piece of her that worked correctly under pressure, even when everything else was coming apart. The hall went very still. Everett stopped reading. He looked up from his scroll, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who had been told this would be a clean proceeding and was now recalculating. Luna Seraphine. I'm not Luna anymore. Is that not the point of this? She let the silence sit for a beat. So you don't need to call me that, and since I am apparently not Luna anymore, I have no obligation to perform the courtesy of staying quiet while someone reads a list of false charges. From above, on the dais, she heard Draven finally shift. Enough, he said. 2 words. His voice, low and precise, cut through the hall the way a blade cuts. Not with volume, but with absolute certainty that it would land. She looked up at him for the first time since they had brought her in. The gray eyes that had once looked at her like she was the only person in a room full of thousands were looking at her now like she was a problem to be managed, like she was a structural fault in a building he needed to repair before it collapsed something important. She had been wrong about the mountains. Mountains do not decide to stop being permanent. Mountains do not look at you with gray eyes and make a calculation. You will hear the judgment, Draven said, and you will accept it. What I will do, Seraphine said, and felt something shift in her chest, something ancient and quiet and very cold, is listen. I can manage that much. Veressa made a small sound beside him. Not a laugh, more like the exhale of a person who has been holding their breath and has just received the signal that they no longer need to. Everett cleared his throat and returned to the scroll. In accordance with the sovereign's judgment, the title of Luna of Ashenvale is hereby revoked. The Lady Veressa of House Moren is to be elevated to the position of royal consort pending formal bonding ceremony, to occur no later than the first moon of the coming season. The hall began to murmur, a low rolling sound that moved through the assembled nobles like wind through long grass, everyone turning to their neighbors to whisper things they'd clearly already known, but now had official permission to say aloud. Seraphine kept her eyes on Draven. He did not look back. Furthermore, Everett said, the former Luna is to be escorted to the eastern guest chambers for the remainder of her confinement, following which arrangements will be made for her relocation to... No. The word came out of her like something she had not decided to say, and yet it arrived fully formed, completely calm, without the tremor she would have expected from a woman kneeling on a cold marble floor with bleeding hands and a child pressing against her ribs from inside. Everett stopped again. I will not be relocated, Seraphine said. I will not be managed. I will not be escorted to a room and kept there while you decide where I'm going to spend the rest of my life. She pressed her hand flat against the floor and began, with some difficulty and absolute refusal to ask for help, to stand. I am leaving this hall on my own feet, and I will decide where I go. The guard captain on her left reached out to take her arm. Don't, she said, without looking at him. He stopped. There were moments, Seraphine had learned, where the only thing between you and what someone was about to do to you was the sound of your own voice delivered at exactly the right register. Not shouting, not pleading, the specific tone of someone who has already decided they will not be moved and is simply informing you of this fact. She was upright. It cost her. Her body, 8 months deep in the work of making another person, protested every inch of it. Her lower back screamed. Her knees were shaking in a way she hoped wasn't visible from the dais, but she was standing. She looked at Draven one more time. You believe her, she said, not because the evidence is convincing, because it is easier to believe her. Something moved through his face. She'd spent years learning his face the way cartographers learn coastlines. Every inlet and edge of it, every place the currents ran strange. She recognized the thing that crossed his expression now. It was not certainty. It was a man who had made a decision he was already halfway convinced was wrong, but who had committed too fully to reverse it without destroying something he wasn't willing to sacrifice. She recognized it because she had watched him make that face on the battlefield too, the moment before a costly tactical call, the moment where he calculated what he could afford to lose. She had not known, until this moment, that she was on that list. "Take care of the child," he said. Quiet. Just to her. The hall was loud enough now with murmuring that the words didn't carry far. She stared at him for a long moment. "I intend to," she said. She walked out of the great hall under her own power, past the rows of noble faces she had spent years memorizing, past the lords and ladies who had eaten at her table and accepted her counsel and now watched her go with the specific fixed expressions of people pretending they did not know her. Nobody stopped her. That was the thing she would remember longest. Not the fall, not the cold floor, not Draven's face or Varessa's exhale, or the sound of 600 people deciding to look away. The fact that nobody stopped her. Chumps. She had 3 hours before dawn. Seraphine knew the palace the way she knew her own breathing. She had walked every corridor of it for 6 years, and before that she had studied the architectural records as part of her preparation to serve as Luna, because she had understood from the beginning that knowing a place was power and not knowing it was exposure. She knew which passages the guards used and which they didn't. She knew which doors had been left unlocked for so long that the locks had seized. She knew the kitchen staff rotation and the timing of the patrol changes and the one stretch of the east wall where the torches didn't reach, because the bracket had never been repaired after the ice damage 3 winters ago. She knew exactly how to leave without anyone seeing her. What she had not fully accounted for was doing it alone, in the dead of a northern winter, 8 months pregnant, with the clothes on her back and whatever she could carry from the chamber without making enough noise to bring the guard. Mira was waiting for her in the corridor outside the guest quarters. Seraphine stopped walking. Mira was 43 years old, broad-shouldered, with gray threading through her brown hair and the blunt, weathered hands of someone who had done hard work her entire life. She had been Seraphine's personal attendant for 4 years. Not a friend, exactly. The distinction mattered in a palace, but something closer than servant. "They told me you'd been taken to the guest wing," Mira said. Her voice was low. She was carrying a pack that hadn't been there an hour ago. "I figured you'd be leaving." Seraphine looked at the pack. "What's in it?" "What fits?" Mira met her eyes. "Heavy wool, emergency rations, the letter opener from your desk, because it's the sharpest thing I could take without someone noticing. 200 silver marks I've been keeping separate from the household accounts for 6 years, because I grew up in a border town, and that is what you do." Seraphine was quiet for a moment. "You grew up in a border town," she repeated. "Thornwall. Nothing left of it now but the name and bad memories." Mira held the pack out. "You should take the north passage behind the laundry. The guard rotation doesn't cover it until the 5th hour." Seraphine took the pack. It was heavier than it looked. "Good." "You could lose your position for this," Seraphine said. "My position." Mira's expression was flat and precise. "My position is attendant to the Luna of Ashenvale. Since there is apparently no longer a Luna of Ashenvale, my position no longer exists. I am, as of approximately 2 hours ago, an unemployed woman in a palace that is about to have a very dramatic morning." A pause. "I would rather be outside the walls when that morning comes." "Where will you go?" "I have a sister in Halveth. I'll manage." Another pause, and something shifted in Mira's expression, the controlled professional surface dropping just enough to show the thing underneath. "You were a good Luna. Whatever they're saying in there, you were a good Luna. And whatever that child turns out to be, they deserve a mother who is still alive to raise them." Seraphine's throat tightened. She did not have time to feel this. She took the pack, adjusted the strap over her shoulder, and turned toward the north passage. "Mira," she said, without looking back. "I know," Mira said. "Go." Boom. The north passage smelled like lye soap and old stone, the deep cold of a corridor that had never been heated because nobody important used it. Seraphine moved through it with her hand flat against the wall, navigating more by memory and texture than the thin gray light that came through the ventilation slits near the ceiling. Ice had formed along the lower edges of the stone. Her breath came out in clouds. Under the wool she'd pulled from the pack in the first alcove, she could feel the cold pressing in from all sides, the specific bitter cold of a northern kingdom in deep winter that had no interest in whether you survived it or not. The child moved, not the small flutter kick that had started around 5 months, the full, deliberate roll of something large enough and strong enough to make her grip the wall and breathe through her teeth for a moment. She pressed her free hand against the side of her abdomen and felt the pressure of a foot or a knee or an elbow pushing back. "I know," she said, quiet. "Not ideal timing, but we're working with what we have." The child pushed again, less agitated this time, or she was imagining it, layering meaning onto physical sensation because she needed there to be a response to something in this frozen corridor. It didn't matter. She moved on. The east wall breach she'd identified years ago was exactly where she remembered it. 12 feet of crumbled stone that had been recorded as a repair task in the maintenance logs, and then quietly deprioritized for 3 consecutive budget cycles because the palace treasurer had other priorities. Seraphine had made a note of it during her second year as Luna and had fully intended to bring it to the council's attention. She was glad she had never gotten around to it. She climbed through it slowly, carefully, one hand always on stone until she was clear. Then she was outside. The cold hit her like something physical, like a wall, like the specific violence of a northern winter unmediated by stone and torch fire. The temperature had dropped further while she had been inside the hall being stripped of everything she had built. The sky above was the dense, featureless black of deep cloud cover, no stars visible, no moon. Snow had begun to fall while she wasn't watching, not the gentle decorative kind, but the real kind, the kind with weight and intent that came in low and nearly horizontal on the wind. Good. Snow-covered tracks. She oriented herself by the wall behind her and the faint glow on the southern horizon that meant the main gate torches, then turned north and walked. Chance. She walked for 3 hours before she allowed herself to stop. The snow was serious by then, the kind of serious that changed the landscape, filled in the hollows, smoothed the edges of things, and made distance harder to judge. Seraphine had been moving on instinct and training and the particular stubbornness that had gotten her through 6 years in a court where every second person was trying to manage her, which was not nothing but was also not the same as a plan. She found the overhang by accident. A shelf of granite jutting out from a hillside, deep enough to get her fully out of the snowfall, the rock above dense enough to hold it. She pressed into the back of the space and lowered herself down with the slow, deliberate movements of a body that had been carrying significant extra weight for months and was now reporting very serious objections. She sat for a while in the dark and just breathed. The panic, which she had been keeping at a very precise distance from herself since the moment the guard's shove had sent her to the floor, chose this moment to knock at the door. She let it in. She had learned early that denying the thing only gave it power. Let it come. Feel the full shape of it, then set it aside. So she felt it. The cold. The aloneness. The weight of what had just been taken from her and the weight of what was pressing against her ribs from inside. The life she had made that was now entirely dependent on decisions she was making in a snowstorm under a rock shelf with 200 silver marks and a letter opener. She was alone. She was alone in a way that went deeper than the physical, alone in the way that meant everyone who should have been between her and this moment had chosen not to be. Draven, who had sworn before every Alpha Lord in 6 territories that he would protect her. The Council, who had watched the proceedings with careful blank faces. The lords and ladies eating her food and now watching her walk out of the hall. Even the guards, who had gotten out of her way because of her voice, not because of any actual loyalty. She let herself feel the full dimension of it. Then she pulled the wool tighter around her shoulders and began to think. The North Road was impassable in this snow. The Eastern Road led back into Ashenvale territory, which was currently not an option. The mountain pass at Greyspine was theoretically passable for another 2 or 3 weeks before the winter closed it entirely, but it was 37 miles on foot through terrain that would be hostile even without the weather and the pregnancy and the total absence of backup. She took inventory of what she had. Physical strength, compromised but not gone. Her body was strong. She had kept training through the pregnancy because the alternative was becoming the kind of person who waited for things to happen to her, and she had never been that person. Resources: 200 silver marks, emergency rations, heavy wool, a letter opener. The pack also contained, on further investigation in the dark, a small whetstone and a length of rope that Mira had apparently added without commenting on it. Mira had packed rope. Seraphine held the rope in her hands for a moment in the dark. There had been a person in that palace who had looked at a pregnant woman being publicly destroyed and responded by packing a rope in case she needed to climb something. That was a kind of loyalty she had not seen from anyone in 6 years of council meetings and diplomatic functions and state dinners. It had come from an unemployed attendant with calloused hands and a sister in Halveth. She coiled the rope and put it back in the pack. Knowledge. She had 6 years of court records, alliance structures, territorial maps, and military assessments in her head, information she had acquired as part of her role as Luna, and that now belonged to no one because you couldn't confiscate what was in someone's mind. She knew which clans in the northern reaches were nominally allied with Ashenvale, but genuinely loyal to no one. She knew which territories were in active disputes that a third party with resources and credibility could step into. She knew which commanders in Draven's army had followed him from genuine respect and which had followed him from calculation and would follow a different calculation if it became compelling. She sat with all of that for a long time under the granite shelf while the snow fell and the child moved in slow, deliberate rhythms against her ribs. By the time the sky began to lighten in the east, which she could tell not by seeing it, but by the change in the quality of the darkness, she had the outline of something that was not yet a plan, but was the beginning of one. She stood up. Her knees were still bruised from the marble. Her hands were cold enough that the cuts had stopped bleeding by sealing, which was useful if uncomfortable. Her back was a sustained complaint that she was categorically refusing to negotiate with. She picked up the pack and looked north. 37 miles to the Grey Spine Pass. On the other side, the northern reaches. Clan territories that Ashenvale had neglected for decades, leaving behind resentment and independence, and the kind of raw, untapped strength that accumulates in people who have been overlooked long enough. She had been overlooked. She understood exactly what that did to a person. She started walking. She reached the first clan settlement 6 days later. 6 days of moving mostly at night when the wind dropped, sleeping in whatever shelter the terrain offered, eating sparingly from the rations, and once, on the 4th day, from a cache of dried meat she found in an abandoned way station that might have been left there a month ago or a year ago and tasted like it could have been either. The pass at Grey Spine had been brutal, a single day of climbing in conditions that made every step a specific negotiation between what her body could do and what she was requiring of it. The cold so complete and total that it had stopped feeling like temperature and started feeling like a substance, like something she was moving through rather than something touching her skin. She had not let herself think about what she was moving away from. She thought about the child instead. She had started talking to the child during the pass, quiet, matter-of-fact conversation delivered under her breath as she climbed, narrating the terrain and her immediate tactical decisions and the specific quality of the ice on the rock face and why she was choosing the left-hand route over the right. The child had moved periodically. She had chosen to interpret this as attentiveness. The settlement was called Ironfang. She knew it from the maps. 60 families, maybe 80 at last census, which had been taken 12 years ago and was therefore essentially fictional. They were nominally under the jurisdiction of Clan Varric, which was nominally aligned with the Ashenvale trade agreements, which meant they were, in practice, aligned with nothing except their own survival. She walked into Ironfang in the late afternoon of the 6th day, visibly pregnant, visibly exhausted, wearing civilian wool that had been high quality 6 days ago and was now the specific texture of a person who had crossed a mountain range in winter without appropriate support infrastructure. 2 men with axes came out to meet her before she'd crossed the settlement threshold. She stopped walking. The larger of the 2 men, broad in the chest with a face that had been broken in at least 2 different places over the years, looked her over with the flat assessment of someone who had learned not to take visible appearances at face value in either direction. Someone looking like they needed help was not necessarily someone who actually needed help. Someone looking like they needed help and walking alone across Gray Spine in winter was either in genuine desperate trouble or something considerably more complicated. "Who are you?" he said. Not a question, a demand. "Someone who has crossed the Gray Spine Pass in 6 days on foot," she said, "and who is still standing, which you should consider before deciding how this conversation goes." He looked at her for a long moment. "You got a name?" "Seraphine." "Where are you from?" She looked at him steadily. "Nowhere that exists for me anymore." The smaller of the two men shifted his grip on his axe. Not aggressive, more like the involuntary movement of someone processing something unexpected. The big man's eyes went to her abdomen, then back to her face. A long calculation happening somewhere behind his expression. "You got a destination?" he said. "Here, for now." A pause. "I have silver. I need shelter until the child is born, and then I need information about this territory." "What kind of information?" "The kind that tells me which clan chiefs in the northern reaches are genuinely interested in something better than what they have now." The axeman stared at her. "And what are you offering?" he said, careful, not dismissive. The careful of a man who had learned that questions like this sometimes had answers worth hearing. Seraphine looked at him across the snow-covered threshold of Iron Fang settlement, with a mountain range behind her and nothing in front of her except what she was willing to build. "Leadership," she said. "That actually works." The child was born on the last night of winter. Seraphine had known it was coming for 2 days. The body's particular insistence that the timeline was no longer subject to negotiation, and had spent those 2 days getting the practical arrangements in order with the specific focused efficiency of a person who has decided that the alternative to being organized is chaos, and chaos is not acceptable. The woman who attended the birth was called Hessa. She was 60 years old, the settlement's healer, and she had delivered somewhere north of 200 children over the course of her career in the northern reaches, which meant she had also not delivered some number of them, and she had the quiet, competent manner of someone who had made peace with the specific math of that. She did not ask Seraphine questions. She gave instructions when instructions were needed, and silence when silence was needed, and at no point treated Seraphine as anything other than a person doing a difficult physical task. Seraphine appreciated this enormously. The birth was long and hard in the way that births in the middle of winter in an unheated stone room with no one you love present are always going to be long and hard. She worked through it with the same approach she'd applied to the mountain pass, the same approach she'd applied to 6 years in a court that wanted her manageable, the same approach she had apparently been applying to every difficult thing since she was old enough to identify the pattern. Feel the full shape of what is happening. Don't lie to yourself about the cost of it. Keep moving. The child was born at the 3rd hour. Hessa put him in her arms. She looked at him for a long time. He was red-faced and furious, which she took as a sign of good character. He had dark hair, a quantity of it, startling against the pale skin. He had Draven's jaw. She noticed that the way you notice a fact that you have decided you are not going to have feelings about right now. "Healthy," Hessa said. "Good lungs, clearly." As evidence, the child was demonstrating this at considerable volume. "Kaelin," Seraphine said. She said it quietly, to him rather than to the room. A name she'd been carrying since somewhere on the mountain pass had arrived fully formed one morning while she was navigating ice, and she'd simply known without needing to examine it. Kaelin. She pressed her nose against the dark hair at the top of his head and breathed him in, and for a long moment she let herself have this without strategy, without the forward-facing calculations, without the outline of the plan that had been assembling itself since the granite shelf. Just this. Just the weight of him, and the cold room, and the fact that they were both still alive. Then she raised her eyes and looked at the far wall of the stone room, past it, through it, across the distance to the great polished hall she had walked out of with bleeding hands, and the cold marble still singing in her knees. A year. Maybe 2. She would need to understand the North fully before she moved. She would need resources and alliances and the kind of reputation that accrued only through demonstrated results. She would need to be patient in a way that was not passive, active patience, the patience of someone building something rather than waiting for something. But the North was full of people who had been overlooked. She understood exactly what that did to a person, and she had just given herself the best possible reason to make sure she did not fail. Indeed, 4 years later, the name had spread far enough that it reached Ashenvale Palace on the lips of a merchant who had traveled through 3 territories and heard it each time, and who mentioned it to a guard captain, who mentioned it to a lord, who brought it to the council table with the specific careful framing of a man who has news he is not certain how to categorize. The Iron Queen of the North. She had united 6 clans in 2 years and 4 in the year after. She had settled 3 territorial disputes that had been generating low-level conflict for a decade, not through mediation, but through the application of a standing army that could enforce whatever she negotiated. She had built a trade network that now moved goods from the deep northern territories down to the central passes with an efficiency that was making the Ashenvale trade agreements look like amateur work by comparison. She had no known origin. She had appeared, fully formed, out of the Greyspine wilderness, with a child at her hip and 100 silver marks she'd apparently converted into a military operation through methods that the Council's intelligence sources were still attempting to reconstruct. "She's building toward something," said Lord Cassiel, who was the Council's current intelligence head, and who had the specific drawn look of a man who had been having a very difficult year. "The territorial consolidation follows a deliberate arc. She's not expanding randomly. She's creating a border." "A border with whom?" said Lord Everick. He was older now, heavier, but still possessed of the same precise administrative affect he'd carried through that night in the Great Hall. Cassiel spread the map on the table. "With us." Silence. Draven stood at the window of the council chamber that looked north, as he had stood at that window with increasing frequency over the past year. He had his hands clasped behind his back. He did not turn around. "The source in Halveth," he said, "the one who mentioned the attendant." "Deceased," Cassiel said. "Natural causes, or presented as such." "The woman." "Mira. Yes, she died in Halveth 18 months ago. Before she died, she told her sister that she had once worked in a palace." A pause. "No other details on record." Another silence. The kind that had a shape to it. The kind that contained something no one in the room was willing to name first. "Do we have a physical description?" Draven said. Still not turning from the window, Cassiel consulted his notes. "Tall, light brown hair, usually worn plain, carries a scar on her right hand from an old wound. Gray eyes." He paused at that last detail and did not add what they all understood it meant. "Travels with a boy, dark hair, approximately 4 years old. Considerable physical development for his age. Sources describe him as..." Another pause. Longer this time. "Sources describe him as looking like he will be very large when he grows." The fire in the council chamber crackled. Veressa was not at the council table. She had been absent from 3 consecutive sessions, which Cassiel had noted, and Everick had noted, and which Draven had apparently decided not to address. "My lord," said Lord Cassiel carefully, "should we be considering the possibility—" "No," Draven said. The word hit the room the same way his voice always hit rooms. Clean, precise, absolute. Nobody pushed it. He pushed. He stood at the window for another long moment, looking north, at the distant mountains he could not see from here, but knew were there, and the territories beyond them that were consolidating around a woman with gray eyes and a 4-year-old son, and a military operation that was, by every account his intelligence services could piece together, beginning to look less like a regional power and more like the early stages of an empire. "Double the northern garrison," he said. "Yes, my lord." "And find out her actual name." Cassiel looked up from his notes, met Draven's eyes when the king finally turned from the window. Something passed through Draven's expression that the chancellor had not seen there in 4 years. Not certainty. Something older than certainty. Something that looked, in the cold light of the council chamber, very much like a man who already knew the answer to the question he was asking and was still asking it because the alternative was accepting that what he had done could not be undone. "Whatever it costs," Draven said. "Find her name." Outside, beyond the northern window, beyond the mountains and the territories and the 4 years of silence he had mistaken for absence, the Iron Queen's banners moved in the winter wind, silver on black, advancing toward a border that was no longer as far away as he had believed. And in the command tent at the edge of the Gray Spine territory, a woman with gray eyes and a scar on her right hand stood over a war table with her generals, her son asleep in the next room under the guard of soldiers who would die before they let anything reach him, and looked at a map of the kingdom she had left behind. She had given Draven 1 year more than she'd planned. She had given him that year because Kaelin had asked, with the particular devastating directness of a 4-year-old who had been raised among warriors and had learned to say true things plainly, whether the man in the picture on the war table had ever known about him. She had looked at her son for a long time before she answered. She had said, "He will." Now she moved her hand across the map, from the northern border to the capital, tracing the route she had spent 4 years preparing for, and spoke to the general standing across the table from her. "How long until the eastern flank is in position?" 6 days, he said. "Make it 4, she said. She straightened, looked at the map, looked at the capital marked at its center, the city she had left in the dark with bleeding hands and nothing but the clothes on her back, and 200 silver marks, and the absolute refusal to be the thing they had decided she was. "Send word to Clan Varric," she said. "Tell them the Iron Queen is ready to move." She paused. "And send a message to King Draven directly." Her general looked up. "What should it say?" Seraphine looked at the map of the kingdom she had left as nothing and was returning to claim. "Tell him," she said, "that the Luna he abandoned is coming home." The message reached Draven's war table 3 days before his northern garrison commander sent word that the border markers at Greyspine had been quietly, methodically replaced overnight. Not torn down. Replaced. New iron stakes, driven deep, bearing a crest he didn't recognize from any registry his herald could locate. A wolf crowned in silver, standing not on a field of conquest but on open ground, facing forward, unbraced. The kind of stance that meant the animal had already decided it was not afraid of what was coming toward it. The garrison commander's message was terse in the way that messages from frightened men trying not to sound frightened always were. No hostile contact, no casualties, no warning. They had simply woken to find the border had moved 6 miles south while they slept, and whoever had done it had left no tracks in the snow worth following. Draven read both messages standing, which was how he read everything that mattered. Sitting felt like receiving. He was not in the business of receiving. He set the messages down on the war table. Lord Cassiel was watching him from across the room with the specific stillness of a man who has learned that the king's first reaction to bad news was the most important data point in his day. "The garrison," Draven said, "doubled as you ordered 3 weeks ago." "And they didn't hear anything." "They heard nothing," Cassiel said. "Which, my lord, is itself information." Draven looked at the map. At the northern territories that had been, 3 years ago, a ragged patchwork of minor clan disputes and forgotten trade agreements. At what they were now, which was something considerably more organized and considerably more pointed in its direction of travel. "She moved the border herself," Draven said. Cassiel said nothing. Not a raiding party, not a survey team, a coordinated operation covering 6 miles of frontier line in a single night, clean enough that 60 soldiers sleeping inside a fortified position didn't detect it. A pause. "That is not a regional chieftain operating above her weight class. That is a military commander who knows exactly what she's doing and wants me to know she knows." "Yes," Cassiel said. Draven's jaw tightened. "And Varessa." Cassiel's expression did the thing it did when he had information he would have preferred not to deliver in person. "Lady Varessa has been in private correspondence with Lord Adric of the Eastern Compact. The volume of correspondence has increased significantly over the past 2 months." "Edric." Draven turned that over. "Edric, whose territory sat along the eastern trade route. Edric, who had been making quiet complaints about the Ashen Vale tariff structure for 3 years. Edric, who had enough military capacity to cause serious problems if he decided to stop being a trade partner and start being something else. What kind of correspondence? Encrypted. We have the volume and timing, but not the content. How long have you known about this? A beat. The beat of a man calculating how honest to be. 6 weeks. The room was very quiet. 6 weeks, Draven said. My lord, I wanted to be certain before 6 weeks, Cassiel. He did not raise his voice. That had never been the mechanism. The mechanism was the complete removal of warmth from his tone, the shift to something that had no temperature at all, and every man who had served under him for more than a season knew exactly what that shift meant. Cassiel straightened. Yes, 6 weeks. I take full responsibility for the delay. Draven turned back to the map. He stood there for a long time, looking at it, and the thing happening behind his eyes was not the tactical calculation that his generals would have recognized. It was something older and less organized than that, the particular internal reckoning of a man who has been keeping several things in separate compartments of his mind for 4 years and is beginning to feel the compartments failing. He had made a decision 4 years ago in the Great Hall, with marble under his boots and a court full of watching faces and a woman on her knees with bleeding hands who looked at him with gray eyes and told him he believed Veressa not because the evidence was convincing, but because it was easier. He had told himself then that she was wrong. He was no longer fully certain she was wrong. Draft a response to the Iron Queen, he said. Cassiel blinked. My lord, a response to her message. She didn't request anything specific. The message simply stated that she was coming home, Draven said. I know what it stated. He picked up the message from the table. Read it again, not because he'd forgotten it, but because he needed to be looking at something other than the map while he decided what he was willing to admit. Tell her I will receive her at Ashenvale, without military escort, neutral terms. Cassiel stared at him. My lord, he said very carefully, the Iron Queen currently commands an estimated, I know what she commands. She has 6 clans under direct allegiance and another 4 in cooperative alliance. Her standing army is, I know what her army is, Cassiel. Then you understand that receiving her on neutral terms is essentially acknowledging that she has the capacity to take what she wants and is choosing not to. Draven set the message down. Yes, I understand that. Draft the response. Veressa read the draft response to the Iron Queen's message in the time it took Draven to walk from the war table to the window and back. She had not been invited to read it. It had been on the table in the council anteroom when she entered, and she had read it with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had spent her entire adult life treating information as property and acquiring as much of it as possible before anyone could reclaim it. She set it back exactly where she had found it. Her face, when she crossed the corridor to her own chambers, showed nothing. Inside, with the door shut and the attendants sent away, she stood at the cold hearth and thought. The Iron Queen. She had known, in the abstract, that the woman existed. The Northern Territories whispered her name with a specific reverence that accrued to someone who had demonstrated, repeatedly, that she could do things people said couldn't be done. Veressa had tracked the reports with professional attention and no personal investment because the Iron Queen was a regional phenomenon in territories that Ashenvale had written off, and regional phenomena in territories nobody cared about did not typically constitute threats. She was revising that assessment now. The rate of territorial consolidation, the military operation that had moved 6 miles of borderline without detection, the message that had arrived not through diplomatic channels but directly, bypassing every layer of court protocol to land on the king's personal correspondence table like a thrown blade, someone who knew how the palace worked. Veressa crossed to her writing desk and sat down. She had maintained her correspondence with Lord Edric carefully and, she had believed, privately. If Cassiel had broken the encryption, she would have known. She had the same access to intelligence reports that Cassiel had, through channels she had cultivated over 4 years of being the woman closest to the king. And there had been no indication in any report she'd seen that her correspondence was under review, which meant either the correspondence was not yet broken and Cassiel only had volume, or the breach had happened through a channel she didn't know existed, which was its own kind of alarming information. She picked up her pen. She needed Edric to move faster than they had planned. Well, the message from the Iron Queen's camp arrived at the Eastern Pass 3 days before Seraphine herself did. The garrison captain at the pass was named Aldous, 40 years in service, missing the top 2 fingers of his left hand from a border skirmish that had happened before most of his current soldiers were born. He received the message with the external calm of a veteran and the internal turbulence of a man who had just been handed something significantly above his clearance level. The message said, "I am coming through the pass. I am coming alone. Stand down." It was sealed with the Iron Wolf crest. Aldous sent a rider to the capital immediately and then stood in the pass with his garrison at attention and waited, because the message said alone, but alone in this context could mean a great many different things, and he was not the kind of man who assumed the optimistic interpretation of ambiguous tactical information. She came through the pass at noon. She was not alone exactly. She had 2 guards flanking her at a distance of 10 yards, both enormous, both wearing the plain gray armor of the northern forces without insignia. They stopped at the pass threshold and went still. She kept walking. Aldous looked at her for the first time. She was tall, in the way that women who have spent years doing physical work in cold climates tend to be tall, built for endurance rather than spectacle. Her hair was pulled back plain, no ornament. She was wearing traveling clothes, good quality but not formal, the gear of someone who covered serious ground regularly. The scar on her right hand was visible when she pulled her glove off to show him her palm, an old habit of northern clans. The open hand meaning "I carry no weapon, I came to talk." Her eyes were gray. He had known, when the message came, from the channel it came through and the language it used, that he had a better-than-average sense of who the Iron Queen was. The suspicion had been building in him for 2 years, fed by scraps of intelligence and the specific way the king stood at the northern window when reports came in, and the thing the king's face did when the name was mentioned that the king absolutely believed was invisible and was not. Looking at those eyes, he stopped suspecting. "Captain," she said, "my lady." He said it before he'd decided to say it. Old instinct. He had saluted this woman before, a long time ago, in halls considerably more comfortable than a mountain pass in winter. Something moved through her expression, not warmth exactly. Recognition. "Your king is expecting me," she said. "He is. I have orders to escort you to the capital." "I know." She pulled her glove back on. "Let's move then. I've been riding since before light, and I'd like to be there before your garrison captain sends a second rider to tell him I arrived looking like exactly what I am." Aldous held the pause of a man choosing his words. "And what is that, my lady?" She looked at him steadily, with the gray eyes that had not changed, and the face that had, in ways he could not have predicted 4 years ago, aged into something harder and considerably more settled in itself. "Someone who has been patient long enough," she said. But they gave her a room in the East Wing, the same wing where she had killed the assassin. Either someone's idea of a message or no one had thought it through, and she had learned a long time ago that in palace logistics, the line between message and carelessness was extremely thin and not worth spending energy on. She stood at the window of the room and looked at the courtyard below while her guards swept the space the way they swept every space, efficiently, without needing to be told. Kalen was not with her. He was in the northern camp with his own guard detail and specific instructions to stay there until she sent word, instructions he had received with the focused gravity of a 4-year-old who had been raised among people who took instructions seriously and had absorbed, entirely too early, the understanding that his mother's work was dangerous. She had looked at his face when she left. She had felt the specific cost of that. The weight of a child watching you ride away on something he understands is not safe, and having the self-possession, age 4, to not ask you to stay. She had filed it in the same place she filed everything that couldn't be resolved yet, the place that was getting crowded. The door opened without a knock. She didn't turn around. "You could knock," she said. "It's my palace," Draven said. "It was mine too, for 6 years. She turned then, because letting him stand at her back was not a dynamic she intended to establish. And I've been in this specific room before, so the symmetry is either deliberate or someone in your logistics office has a bleak sense of humor. He looked older. 4 years, same as her, but on him it showed differently. The jaw was the same. The gray eyes were the same, but the lines around them were deeper, and there was something behind those eyes that had not been there before. Something that moved the way guilt moves when it's been living in a person long enough to become structural. She had not let herself prepare for how it would feel to be in the same room as him. She was managing. "You came alone," he said. "I came with 2 guards and a garrison escort. Don't make it more dramatic than it is. You left your army at the border." "My army is at the border because you need to understand that I can call it forward whenever I choose, and because the point of this meeting is not military demonstration." She held his gaze. "We both know I don't need to be standing inside your palace to take it." He absorbed that without flinching, which she noted. He had earned that, at least. Whatever else he had done, he had never been a man who flinched from hard truths when they were delivered directly. "Why are you here?" he said. "You sent an invitation." "I sent an invitation because you told me you were coming." "Why are you coming?" She looked at him for a long moment. There were several versions of this conversation she had rehearsed over 4 years, alone in a tent or on a road, or in the brief hours between tactical reviews, and none of them had started with this specific question asked in this specific tone, which was not the tone of a king managing a territorial threat. It was the tone of a man trying to understand something he had broken. "Because I have a son," she said, "who has Ashenvale blood, and who deserves to know what that means. And because every conspiracy that was buried in this palace 4 years ago is still here, and if I don't come in through the door, I'm going to have to come in through the wall, and that is going to cost significantly more lives than I am willing to spend." The word conspiracy landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Draven was very still. "Veressa," he said, flat, not a question. "Among others." She watched his face carefully. "You know." "I don't know anything." "You suspect." She took a step toward the center of the room, not toward him, just away from the window, because the window at her back had stopped feeling like a neutral position. "You've suspected for at least 2 years. Cassiel has been sitting on the Eastern correspondence for 6 weeks, and you haven't confronted her. That is not the behavior of a man who believes his consort is innocent. That is the behavior of a man who doesn't know what happens to his kingdom if he's wrong about her." His jaw tightened. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I was your Luna for 6 years, she said. "I sat in every council session. I read every intelligence brief. I know exactly how this palace operates, and I know exactly the kind of evidence trail that Veressa would leave because I watched her build it in real time before I had the seniority to do anything about it." She stopped. "Let that sit. You're not going to tell me I don't know what I'm talking about." The silence between them had a shape now. It had walls and weight and the specific charge of everything that had not been said for 4 years pressing against the available air. Draven crossed to the window where she had been standing. He looked out at the courtyard below, his back to her, and she recognized the posture because she had seen it 1,000 times in council chambers. It was the posture of a man processing something he didn't want to process while keeping his face away from the room. "The child," he said. She said nothing. "Is he?" "Yes," she said. Simple. No inflection. Another silence. "And he's healthy." "He is exceptional," she said, and let 1 degree of temperature into her voice, just 1, because she was not going to pretend it didn't exist. "He is 4 years old, and he can already track better than most of your garrison soldiers, and he has your jaw in my judgment, and he asked me, when I left, whether the man in the picture on the war table had known about him." Draven turned from the window. She met his eyes. "What did you tell him?" he said. "I told him you would," she said. The room was very quiet. Draven looked at her with the gray eyes that had once been the thing she trusted most in the world, and what was in them now was not the comfortable certainty she'd loved him for. It was rawer than that. It was the specific devastation of a man confronting the arithmetic of his own choices and finding that it does not balance. She had thought once that seeing this would feel like something, like satisfaction or vindication or the closing of a wound. It felt like standing in the cold. Necessary, not warm. "I need to see the Eastern correspondence," she said. His expression shifted. The rawness closed, or partially closed, the tactical layer sliding back over it like a shutter. "That is an internal intelligence matter. Draven." She said his name without title, which she had not done since the Great Hall, and watched him register it. "Veressa has been selling your eastern territories to the Compact. She has been doing it for at least a year, possibly longer. If Edric moves before you have the evidence consolidated, you will lose the eastern flank, and this empire will fracture along a line that cannot be repaired." She held his gaze without blinking. "I am not here to take your throne. I am here because the alternative to working with you is watching your kingdom collapse into a war that kills 10,000 people who had nothing to do with what happened in this hall 4 years ago. That is not a price I am willing to pay to be right." He stared at her for a long time. The fire in the room crackled once and went back to its low, steady burn. "The correspondence is in the war room," he said. "Cassiel will have it." "Good." She turned toward the door. "And Draven?" He was still looking at her. "Whatever you have been telling yourself about that night," she said, "for 4 years, whatever version you have been living with, you need to let it go before we walk into that war room. I don't need you to feel it. I need you to be functional." A pause. "There is someone in this palace who has been feeding Veressa information from inside your council for at least 2 years. Until we identify them, every conversation we have is potentially compromised." His jaw went tight. "Who?" She looked at him steadily. "That is what we are going to find out," she said. "Tonight." She opened the door. Behind her, she heard him exhale. A single, controlled breath, the specific sound of a man recalibrating every assumption he had been operating on for the past 4 years. Good. She needed him recalibrated. What she did not tell him, because the time for that conversation had not yet arrived, was what she had found 2 weeks ago in the Northern Intelligence reports. The thing that had accelerated her timeline. The thing that had made her call her generals and say 4 days instead of 6. A name. A name that appeared in the Eastern correspondence, encrypted but not well enough. A name that belonged to someone who sat on Draven's inner council and had sat there for 6 years, and who had been in the Great Hall on the night she knelt on marble, wearing a careful, neutral face, while the king made the decision that this particular person had spent 2 years engineering. She had not yet told Draven this name, because the name was Cassiel. She did not tell him in the corridor. She did not tell him walking through the East Wing passage toward the war room, with 2 palace guards trailing at the distance Draven had apparently decided was respectful enough to not constitute surveillance and close enough to not constitute trust. She did not tell him when they passed the door to the council chamber, where she had spent 6 years learning exactly which men in that room said one thing to Draven's face and kept a separate accounting in their heads. She kept Cassiel's name behind her teeth and walked. The war room was on the 2nd floor of the North Tower, a room she knew the way she knew the inside of her own hands. Draven had always worked here rather than the formal council chamber when the work was real, when it was maps and troop counts, and the actual granular decisions rather than the performed ones. She had sat at this table more times than she could number. She had argued across it, convinced men across it, occasionally lost across it in ways she'd had to accept and move past. Cassiel was already there. He was standing at the far end of the table when they entered, and he looked up from the documents in his hand with the controlled expression of a man who had been told the Iron Queen was in the palace and had spent the past 2 hours deciding how to position himself for whatever came next. His eyes moved to her face. She watched him process the fact that she was looking at him the way she was looking at him, and watched something shift behind his expression, something very small and very fast, the specific micro-movement of a man recalculating. Good. Let him recalculate. "Lord Cassiel," she said, flat, no inflection. "My lady." He said it the way Aldous had said it at the pass, involuntary, old habit. Then he corrected himself, and she watched the correction happen. "Iron Queen." "We need the Edric correspondence," Draven said, moving to the head of the table. He did not look at Seraphine. He was in the mode she recognized, the closed tactical mode, moving with the focused efficiency of a man who had decided to operate rather than feel.
She had always admired that about him, and had also, in the last 4 years, understood exactly how dangerous it was. Men who were very good at operating and very good at not feeling could be aimed. The question was always who was doing the aiming. Of course, Cassiel moved to the document chest against the wall. His movements were smooth, too smooth, in the way that rehearsed calm is always slightly too smooth, slightly too even in its rhythm. He had known they would ask for this. He had prepared for being asked for this. I have the full volume record and the partial decryption we managed on the most recent. All of it, Seraphine said. He paused at the chest, just briefly. All of it, he said. Yes. He brought the documents to the table and spread them. Seraphine moved to the table's edge and looked at the layout without touching anything yet. Volume logs, timing charts, the partial decryption, 3 pages of it, fragments surfacing through the cipher in isolated phrases and partial sentences the way wreckage surfaces after something sinks. She looked at the partial decryption. She read it carefully. The fragments were enough. She had read intelligence documents in partial states for 4 years, had trained herself to reconstruct the architecture of a thing from its exposed edges, and what these edges showed her was a correspondence that went significantly deeper than trade complaints. Troop dispositions, supply route vulnerabilities, the specific timing windows of the Northern Garrison rotation, which was information that should have been contained to the Inner Council and the garrison commanders themselves. She looked at Cassiel. He was watching her read with the expression of a man watching someone diffuse something, very still, monitoring every movement. When did you begin the decryption work? She said. 3 weeks ago, he said. The volume logs show correspondence starting 14 months back. We only identified it as a priority 3 weeks ago. You identified it as a priority, she said, 6 weeks ago. You told Draven 6 weeks ago. Why was decryption not initiated until 3 weeks ago? A pause. Resource constraints, Cassiel said. The cipher analysis team was engaged with the garrison rotation timing, she said. It's in the partial. Fragment 7, second page. The Eastern Garrison runs a rotation change every 12 days, patrol overlap at the 3rd hour. That is not information that appears in any document outside this war room and the garrison commander's personal log. She let the silence develop for exactly 1 beat. How did it get into Varessa's correspondence with Edric? The room had a different quality now. Draven was standing at the head of the table, and he had gone very still in the way he went still when he was assembling something he didn't want to be true and couldn't stop himself from assembling. Cassiel's face was controlled. It was extremely controlled, which was itself the problem, because a man who is genuinely surprised by an accusation does not look controlled. He looks disrupted. That is a serious implication, Cassiel said. It is a serious fragment, she said. Do you want to explain it? There are other explanations, other sources. Name one that doesn't require the information to have passed through someone in this room. His jaw tightened. My lord, he said, turning to Draven, and the move itself was information. The turn away from her toward the man whose authority he had spent 20 years cultivating, the instinctive return to the relationship he could leverage. This woman is making an accusation against your longest-serving intelligence officer based on a fragment of encrypted text that hasn't been fully— How did she know about the Eastern correspondence? Draven said. Cassiel stopped. Draven had not moved from the head of the table. He was looking at Cassiel with the gray eyes that had gone flat and very precise, and his voice when he spoke had the quality of something that had already decided its destination and was simply moving toward it.
I told no one outside this council that Varessa had Eastern correspondence under review, Draven said. The garrison commanders don't know. The household staff don't know. The only people who knew were sitting in the council chamber 6 weeks ago, when you brought it to me. A pause. She told me tonight that you had been sitting on it for 6 weeks. She knew the specific timeline. She knew it before she walked into this room. Cassiel said nothing. How? Draven said. The silence stretched. Something changed in Cassiel's face, not dramatically, not the way it happened in the war stories, the sudden crack, the flood of confession. It was subtler than that. It was the very small, very controlled release of a man who has been maintaining a performance for a long time and has just calculated that the performance is no longer tenable
and is deciding what comes after it. I want to be clear, Cassiel said, and his voice was different now, the professional warmth gone, that what happened 4 years ago was not personal. The temperature of the room dropped. Draven moved before she could speak, one step forward, and the movement had nothing casual in it. Say that again. You were making a mistake, Cassiel said, and he was looking at Draven now with the specific directness of a man who has decided that if the performance is ending, he will at least end it on his own terms. The Luna was strong. She was too strong. She was building relationships with the clan chiefs independently. She had the northern correspondence channels. She had the garrison commander's loyalty in a way that should have belonged to you. In 5 years, she would have had the council. In 10 years, she was my Luna, Draven said, each word landing separately. She was a power structure you didn't fully control, Cassiel said. And Varessa offered a manageable alternative. I introduced them. I facilitated the early correspondence. The assassination attempt was not something He stopped, chose his next words. That escalated beyond what I had sanctioned. Varessa has her own methods. Seraphine was standing very still. She had known this, in the architectural sense, had assembled it from scraps over 4 years the way she had assembled everything, from exposed edges and partial fragments, and the spaces between things where the truth lived. She had known someone on the council had engineered it. She had identified Cassiel through the correspondence 3 weeks ago, and had spent 3 weeks turning that knowledge over, looking at it from every angle, feeling its weight. She had thought she was prepared for the room where it was confirmed. She had not fully accounted for the specific physical sensation of hearing a man describe the destruction of her life as a resource allocation decision. Not personal. She breathed through it, steady, in through the nose, out slow, the discipline she had built on a mountain pass, and in a stone room in a northern settlement, and in 4 years of making something from nothing in a wilderness that did not care whether she survived. The discipline of a woman who had learned that the cost of losing control of herself in a critical moment was paid not by her alone. Her hands were flat on the table. She looked at Cassiel. The assassination attempt, she said. Her voice came out level. She was faintly surprised by this. You introduced Varessa to the palace network. You facilitated her access to the king. You knew she had ordered someone into my chamber. I knew afterward, Cassiel said, and you said nothing. A pause. No. Because it had the convenient effect of providing evidence for the charges against me. His jaw tightened. The first crack in the controlled surface. Yes. The fire in the war room crackled. Draven hit the table. Not in a controlled way, not the precise, calibrated gesture of a king managing his response. A single flat strike, both palms, hard enough that the document pile shifted and the inkwell jumped, and the sound of it in the stone room was very loud. 20 years, he said. His voice had gone low and rough in a way she had never heard from him. 20 years I trusted you in this room. And I served you well for 19 of them, Cassiel said. The northern expansion, the Halveth Accords, the eastern trade routes, everything that made this empire function. Get out of my sight. My lord, if you are still in this room in 60 seconds, Draven said, I will not be responsible for what happens after that. Cassiel looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at Seraphine. Something moved through his expression when he looked at her, something that was not quite guilt and not quite defiance, and occupied the complicated territory between them. You built something impressive, he said, in the north, genuinely impressive, but understand that you are walking into a palace that has been managed against you for years, and Cassiel is not the only name in that correspondence. He picked up nothing. He walked out. The door closed. Draven stood at the head of the table with his hand still pressed flat against the surface and breathed. Seraphine looked at the closed door. Cassiel is not the only name. She had known that too. Had known it the way she knew the shape of the northern wind, not from a single source, but from the accumulated pattern of how things had moved, how information had flowed, how her exile had been maintained not just by a conspiracy of two, but by a network that had found it useful to keep her out. But she had not known, until this moment, exactly how broad it was. He's going to Varessa, she said. Draven lifted his head. Right now, she said.
He's going to Veressa, and she is going to know within the next 10 minutes that the performance is finished, and she has one window left. She will use it. She was already moving around the table toward the door. Where is she in the palace right now? Her chambers, in the West Wing. Does she have guards she controls personally? Not palace guards. Hers. A beat. A beat that was too long. A beat that contained a man realizing he did not know the answer to a question about his own palace. There are attendants. How many of the palace guard captains did Cassiel appoint? Draven stared at her. Draven. How many? 3, he said. Out of 7. 3 out of 7. 3 captains who owed their positions to the man who had just walked out of the war room knowing exactly what was coming. 3 captains who had been managing information inside this palace for years. She pulled the war room door open. Her 2 guards were in the corridor outside, exactly where they'd been told to wait, and they straightened immediately when they saw her face. The West Wing, she said. Now. They moved. She moved with them, Draven's footsteps behind her, and she was calculating as she walked, mapping the palace against the information she had, measuring the distance between the war room and the West Wing against the distance Cassiel had covered on foot, measuring the gap between the decision Veressa would make and the time available to get ahead of it. They were not going to get ahead of it. She understood this by the time they reached the West Wing corridor, understood it from the specific quality of the silence, the absence of the ambient sounds a staffed wing of the palace produced, the footsteps and low voices, and the particular creak of this floor under regular traffic. The West Wing corridor was empty, every door closed, no staff visible. Seraphine stopped walking. One of her guards moved past her, hand on his blade, checking the first closed door. He looked back at her and shook his head. Empty. Her chambers, Draven said, and she could hear the specific controlled flatness in his voice that meant he was managing something very large, very hard. He moved past her to the door at the end of the corridor and pushed it open. The room was empty. Not abandoned. The fire was still burning. There was wine on the table, 1 cup partially full. The wardrobe doors were open and the wardrobe was not stripped, the expensive gowns still hanging, the jewel box still on the dressing table. She'd left in a hurry. She'd left taking only what mattered and leaving everything that would slow her down, which told Seraphine something about what Veressa had actually been planning, what she'd been carrying close versus what she'd been performing. Draven stood in the doorway of the room. Seraphine looked at the fire, the wine, the open wardrobe. She looked at the dressing table. The jewel box was open, most of the contents still inside. But there was a space in the velvet lining, a deliberate fitted space the size of a document folded 3 times. Whatever had been stored there, Veressa had taken it. She had documentation, Seraphine said. Draven looked at the empty space in the jewel box. Insurance, Seraphine said. Something she collected as leverage, something she needed to have on her if this ended. She turned around and looked at Draven in the doorway. She is going to Edric. She has whatever is in that document, and she has Cassiel's network, and she has 4 years of access to your inner circle, and she is going east. He looked at her. The controlled flatness had broken. What was underneath it was not what she would have predicted, standing in a great hall 4 years ago watching him choose correctly. It was not the cold precision of a king managing a tactical problem. It was something rawer and more honest than that, the specific undone look of a man who had made a series of decisions that he had justified to himself for years and had just watched the full architecture of those justifications collapse in a single evening. She played me, he said. She didn't answer that. There was no answer she could give him that was both honest and kind, and she had used up her allocation of kindness for the evening. The eastern border, she said. What is your garrison strength at the Edric line? He pulled himself back. She watched him do it, the visible act of shutting the door on the thing he was feeling and turning back toward function. 4,000. But if Cassiel's people have been feeding Edric the rotation, then Edric knows exactly where the gaps are. She was already moving back toward the corridor. I need to reach my camp. Your camp is 3 days north. I have a relay system. I can have orders to my eastern command in 6 hours. She turned at the door to look at him. Do you trust any of your garrison captains? The ones Cassiel didn't appoint. Aldous? he said immediately. Send him east tonight with everything you can move without going through the standard command chain. He doesn't report to anyone who sat in that council chamber. She looked at him steadily. Can you do that? A pause. Yes. Then do it. She turned again. Seraphine. She stopped. She did not turn around. I know, Draven said from behind her, that there is nothing I can say tonight that changes what happened. I know that. A pause. The long, ragged pause of a man choosing between the version of this he could manage and the version that was actually true. I just need you to know that I'm not going to be the thing I was that night, whatever it costs to not be that thing. She stood in the corridor with her back to him and felt the full shape of that, the specific weight of 4 years of a person finally saying the thing she had needed them to say at a time when the saying of it existed inside a burning palace, with an enemy in the wind and an empire fracturing along fault lines that had been built while they both weren't looking. She had imagined this moment. She had imagined it dozens of times in the north, in the tent, on the road, in the early hours when Kaelin was asleep, and she had nothing to do but think. She had imagined what it would feel like to hear him say something true. It felt like standing in the cold, necessary, not warm. Your son, she said, is waiting in the northern camp for word from me. He is 4 years old and he has your jaw, and he has been waiting patiently because I told him I would send word, and he trusts me completely. She let that sit for a moment. Make sure you deserve that. She walked out. Behind her, in the empty corridor of the West Wing, she heard him exhale. She was already calculating the next 6 hours, the relay, the Eastern Command, the gap between Varessa's head start and what she could close with the resources she had positioned. She was already running the architecture of what this had just become, not the controlled diplomatic operation she had planned, not the careful reconstruction she had spent 4 years building toward, but something that had fractured and was now falling faster than she had designed for. Cassiel was free in the palace. 3 guard captains owed him their positions. Varessa was in the wind with a document and a network, and 4 years of preparation for exactly this contingency. And somewhere in the palace, in rooms Seraphine had not yet mapped, there were other names in that correspondence, people who had found it useful to keep her exiled, and would find it considerably more useful to ensure she never consolidated the power she had come here to claim. She reached the East Wing staircase and took it at a pace that made her guards work to keep up. She had 6 hours, and she was done being patient. The plan she had built over 4 years, the careful, measured reconstruction, the diplomatic approach, the invitation accepted on neutral terms, all of it had just been taken from her by a man who described the destruction of her life as not personal and walked out of a war room with his chin up. Fine. She had built an empire from a letter opener and 200 silver marks. She could build a war from whatever was left of tonight. The relay rider left the palace's north gate at the 2nd hour of morning, carrying a cipher that only Seraphine's eastern commander could read. She watched him go from the courtyard and felt the specific satisfaction of a variable eliminated. The rider would reach the first relay post in 4 hours. Her eastern flank would have orders before dawn painted the horizon. Whatever Varessa was moving toward, she would not find the eastern approach uncontested. That was the clean part. That was the last clean part. She turned back to the palace and began working the problem of everything else. Draven had spent the first hour after she left the West Wing corridor moving through the palace with the controlled fury of a man dismantling infrastructure he had built with his own hands. She heard the results before she saw them. Raised voices in the guard captain's quarters, the specific metallic sound of swords surrendered, a shouted exchange that cut off abruptly somewhere in the north corridor. By the time she reached the main hall, 2 of Cassiel's 3 guard captains were in custody, and the 3rd had apparently made a decision about which direction the tide was running and had come forward on his own. He was standing in the hall when she walked through, wrists bound in front of him, a man of 50 with a soldier's bearing and the face of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had just set it down. His name was Garrett. She knew him. He had been a junior guard captain during her tenure as Luna before Cassiel elevated him. She stopped in front of him. The 3rd cipher key, she said. Cassiel's private channel to Varessa's network. Where is it? He looked at her for a moment. His jaw worked. Stone room, he said. Behind the war room hearth, loose block, second row from the floor, left side. There's a box. She left him there and went. The box was exactly where he said. Inside it, the cipher key, and 3 letters she had not expected. Letters from names she recognized, names that belonged to lords who currently held border territories and had been attending Draven's council for years. Lords who had eaten at her table when she was Luna and watched her kneel on marble and said nothing. She read them once, quickly, standing at the cold hearth with the war room fire crackling behind her. Then she folded them and put them inside her armor and walked back out. Draven found her in the corridor. "Cassiel," he said. His jaw was tight, his eyes dark. "He's gone. Took a horse from the east stable. One of the grooms saw him go but didn't know to stop him." Of course he was gone. Cassiel had spent 20 years managing information. He had known, the moment she walked into that war room with gray eyes, and the specific way she looked at him, that the window was closing. He had drawn out the conversation in the war room not from arrogance, but from calculation, buying himself exactly the minutes he needed to arrange an exit while Draven processed his devastation. She had underestimated how quickly he would move. She would not do it again. "He's going to Varessa," she said. "Same direction. He knows where she's heading." "East," Draven said. "East." She looked at him. "You need to mobilize now, not in the morning, not at first light. Now, tonight, before Cassiel reaches Edric's forward scouts and tells them exactly what your response capacity looks like, and exactly where the gaps are in your eastern flank." She held his gaze. "Can you do it?" He held her gaze back. "I've mobilized an army before." "Then move it." He was already turning toward the stairs. The Imperial gathering of alphas was not something Seraphine had planned to accelerate. The gathering was a seasonal convening of the 6 major alpha rulers in the region, a tradition old enough that its origins were genuinely disputed, a meeting that functioned not as a council so much as a collective pressure release system where territorial disputes could be aired and alliances could be repositioned without formal declaration of war. It was scheduled for the following month at the neutral grounds of Vethmark, a city that belonged to no single alpha and therefore belonged to all of them. She had planned to arrive there in control of the Northern Empire, with Kaelin beside her, with the Ashenvale situation resolved into something she had negotiated rather than taken. She had planned to stand before the assembled alphas as a complete fait accompli, the question of succession already answered, the territory already stable. She had not planned to arrive there because the situation had exploded ahead of schedule, and Vethmark was the only location within reach where she could guarantee Varessa could not disappear into Eastern territory and run this from a distance indefinitely. But that was what was happening. The message reached her at the 3rd hour, carried by one of her own network riders who had come south through the mountain pass at a pace that had burned through 2 horses. The rider was gray-faced and breathing hard when they brought him to her in the war room, and he delivered the message standing because sitting down apparently felt wrong, given the content. Varessa had not gone to Edric directly. Varessa had gone to Vethmark. She had invoked an emergency convening of the gathering, which was a provision that existed for genuine existential crises, and had been used exactly twice in recorded history, and she had sent riders to every Alpha Lord in the region with a message that framed the Iron Queen's presence in Ashenvale Palace, not as diplomacy, but as invasion. The gathering would convene in 4 days. Every Alpha Lord in the region would be in one room. And Varessa, who had spent 4 years watching Seraphine build an empire from nothing, and had correctly identified the one scenario where that empire was most vulnerable, was going to stand in that room and define the terms of the conversation before Seraphine arrived. Seraphine read the message twice. She did not feel panic. She had noticed over the years that panic had become less available to her as a response to extreme situations, replaced by something that functioned like cold clarity, a narrowing of focus that eliminated everything except the immediate problem and the available resources. She was not certain this was entirely healthy. She was also not certain it mattered. She looked at the rider. "What's Edric's position? Has he moved troops?" "Forward scouts only. He hasn't committed. He was waiting to see which way the gathering went." "Smart." "Go rest," she said. "You've earned it." She looked at the message for a long moment after he left. Varessa had made one error. One error in an otherwise well-executed pivot, and it was this. She had announced the gathering publicly enough that word had reached Seraphine's network before it reached every alpha on the invitation list, which meant Seraphine had the same 4 days, and 4 days was enough to do something Veressa clearly believed was impossible. She sent the message to the northern camp that night. Bring Kalen. Potek. They rode hard for 2 days. Seraphine, Draven, 24 of the most reliable soldiers either of them had left after the culling of Cassiel's network, and the dispatch rider who knew the back roads through the Midland territories well enough to cut a day off the standard route to Vethmark. Draven rode well. He had always ridden well. She noticed this the way she noticed everything about him now, with the particular detached precision of a person cataloging variables, useful, not useful, and filing them accordingly. He didn't complain about pace or terrain. He didn't try to take the lead when she was navigating. He kept his position in the formation, and he kept his mouth shut except when he had something worth saying, which was not nothing. At the first night's camp, in the shelter of a ridgeline that broke the worst of the wind, he sat across the fire from her and said, "Tell me about him." She looked up from the map. "Kalen," he said. Not a demand. The specific, careful tone of a man asking for something he understands he hasn't earned. She was quiet for a moment. "He is cautious the way clever people are cautious," she said. "He thinks before he moves. He asks questions about everything and he remembers every answer." She looked back at the map. He learned to track from a man named Bram, who lost 3 fingers to a wolf bite and has approximately 0 patience for carelessness. Kalen can follow a trail in snow that Bram says most veterans would miss. He's 4. He started at 2.5. A pause. He is serious about things he cares about, and entirely unserious about everything else. He makes people around him want to be better at things, which is not a skill most adults possess. She felt the edge of something and controlled it. He told me once, when he was 3, that he thought I worked too much. I asked him how he knew what too much was, and he said because I looked tired in my eyes, even when I was smiling. She flattened the corner of the map that was trying to curl in the wind. I thought about that for a long time. Draven was quiet. "He's going to walk into Vethmark in 2 days," Seraphine said, "and stand in front of 6 Alpha Lords, and every one of them is going to look at him and see what he is. That is not something I can prepare him for. It is just something that is going to happen." "He'll manage it," Draven said. She looked at him across the fire. "You don't know him yet," she said. "No," he said, "but I know you, and you raised him." She held his gaze for a moment and said nothing, because the thing she would have said 4 years ago was still true, and she was not ready to say it, and the thing she could safely say right now was insufficient, and the gap between those 2 things was where she was living at this particular moment in her life. She looked back at the map. "Get some sleep," she said. "We move at first light." Kalen arrived at the Vethmark staging camp on the morning of the 3rd day, riding in front of a guard captain named Riva, who had been with Seraphine since the 2nd year in the north, and who would, Seraphine knew, have carried the boy out on her back through active combat before she let anything reach him. Seraphine was in the camp's main tent when she heard the horses. She came out. Kalen was already off the horse before Riva had fully stopped, landing with the compact, controlled movement of a child who had grown up around people who moved carefully and had absorbed it entirely. He was wearing northern gray, plain and functional, his dark hair loose around his face, and he crossed the campground toward her with the focused directness of someone who had been sitting on a horse for 2 days with a specific destination in mind. She crouched down as he reached her. He put both arms around her neck and held on for a moment, tight, without saying anything. She put one hand against the back of his head and held him back. "I'm all right," she said quietly. He pulled back and looked at her face with the gray eyes she had not prepared herself for, the precise, seeing eyes that looked at her the way she looked at everything, cataloging, comparing, measuring the gap between what she said and what her face was doing. "You look tired," he said. "I am tired," she said. "I've been riding for 2 days." "Is it working?" he said. "The plan." She looked at him for a moment. "It's adapting." He considered this. "That's not a no." "No," she said. "It's not a no." He looked past her shoulder then, and she felt the shift in his attention before she followed his gaze, knowing already what he was looking at, because there was only one thing in this camp that he hadn't seen before. Draven was standing 20 feet away at the edge of the tent line. He had come out when he heard the horses and had stopped when he saw the boy, and was standing very still in the way that people stand when they are trying not to do something that might change the outcome of what they're watching. Kaelin looked at him for a long time. Then he looked back at Seraphine. "That's him," he said. Not a question. "Yes," she said. Another long moment, the specific gravity of a 4-year-old processing something enormous with the seriousness it deserved. "Does he know about me?" Kaelin said. "He does now," she said. Kaelin looked back at Draven. Something moved through his face that she couldn't fully read, and she had been reading his face since the first moment she held him in a cold stone room in Ironfang. He was thinking. He was doing the careful, prior-to-movement thinking that Bram had cultivated in him, measuring the ground before he stepped on it. Then he stood up straight and walked toward Draven. Seraphine stayed where she was and did not intervene, because this was not a moment she could navigate for him, and she had always known it wasn't. Kaelin stopped in front of Draven and looked up at him. Draven looked down. "My mother says I have your jaw," Kaelin said. Whatever Draven had prepared himself for, it was not that. She watched it land on him, watched the careful control he'd been maintaining crack along a specific line, and watched him crouch down to put himself at eye level with the boy the way she had, with the movement of a man who understood that looking down from height was the wrong way to begin this. "She told me that too," Draven said. "Is it true?" Draven looked at him. "Yeah," he said, rough. "I think it is." Kaelin studied his face with the focused attention he gave everything that mattered to him. Then he said, with the economy of someone who has decided the important question and is asking it directly, "Were you trying to protect her when you sent her away?" The camp was very quiet. Draven held the boy's gaze. "No," he said. "I wasn't. I made a mistake." Kaelin considered this for a moment. "Okay," he said. Then, "She's building something important. You should help." He turned and walked back toward Riva, who was seeing to the horses with the expression of a woman who had been maintaining professionalism in difficult situations for 4 years, and was finding this particular one somewhat more challenging than usual. Draven stayed crouched for a moment after the boy left, looking at the ground. Seraphine walked past him toward the main tent. "Tomorrow," she said, without stopping. "Get some sleep, but..." Vethmark on the day of the gathering was a city wound tight. The neutral grounds hosting the convening were outside the city proper, a series of stone halls built specifically for the purpose, large enough to accommodate the retinues of 6 Alpha Lords, and designed so that no single delegation had a better position than any other. Seraphine had been here once before, years ago, as part of Draven's retinue before she was Luna. She remembered the way the space worked, the sight lines, the acoustics, the specific geography of who stood where and what that communicated. She arrived with Draven on her left, Kaelin on her right, and 12 guards at her back. She had not announced herself. Veressa had. The entrance hall was full when they walked in. Lords and their advisors clustered in the pre-session configurations that told you everything about current alliances if you knew how to read them. The silence that moved through the room when Seraphine entered was the particular silence of a large number of people recalibrating at speed. Veressa was at the far end of the hall. She was wearing white, which Seraphine noted as a deliberate choice, the color of uncontested authority in northern territories, and she had Cassiel at her shoulder, which meant he had ridden hard and arrived ahead of them, which meant Seraphine's timeline estimates had been slightly off. Noted. Their eyes met across the hall. Veressa looked at Seraphine, then at Draven, then at Kaelin standing straight at Seraphine's right side with his dark hair and his gray eyes and the jaw that every person in this room who had known Draven for more than 5 years was going to recognize. Something moved through Veressa's expression. She had prepared for Seraphine. She had not fully prepared for the boy. The gathering moderator, an elderly Alpha Lord named Brennan, who had been performing this function for longer than most of the people in the room had been alive, moved to the center of the hall and raised his hand for attention. "The emergency convening is now in session," he said. Lady Veressa of Ashenvale has called this gathering under the provision of territorial crisis. All lords are present. All testimony will be heard. He looked around the room. Lady Veressa, you called this convening. You have the floor. Veressa walked to the center of the hall. She spoke well. She had always spoken well. Seraphine listened to the shape of it more than the content, the architecture of the argument, the sequence of claims, where she was building toward and what she was using to build it. The framing was clean. The Iron Queen had entered Ashenvale Palace under the guise of diplomacy while her army held the northern border, a military pressure tactic that constituted de facto invasion, and the stability of the entire region depended on the assembled lords refusing to legitimize it. She did not mention the assassination attempt. She did not mention the Eastern correspondence. She did not mention Cassiel's confession in the war room. She was very good. When she finished, Brennan looked across the hall. The Iron Queen is present. She will be heard. Seraphine walked to the center of the hall. She did not look at Veressa. She looked at the assembled Alpha Lords, at the faces she had studied from a distance for 4 years, and some of which she had known personally from a life that had been taken from her. And she felt the weight of the room the way you feel, the weight of a thing you have been carrying for a long time without calling it by its name. Before I speak to the question of territory, she said, I'm going to introduce someone. She looked back. Kalen walked forward. He walked with the particular straight-backed composure of a child who understood that people were looking at him and had decided that this was not a reason to change how he moved. He stopped beside her. The room was very still. She watched the Alpha Lords look at him, watched the recognition move through their faces, the specific moment where the dark hair and the jaw and the gray eyes assembled into an arithmetic that their minds completed without being asked to. Lord Brennan's face went through several stages. This is Kalen, Seraphine said. He is 4 years old. He was born in the northern reaches in the last week of winter, 4 years ago. After I crossed the Greyspine Pass alone on foot in the dead of a blizzard following my public removal from the position of Luna of Ashenvale. She let that sit. His existence was not known to this assembly because his existence was not safe to announce while the people responsible for the attempt on my life remained in positions of power. That condition changed 2 nights ago. She looked at Veressa. I would invite Lady Veressa, she said, to explain to this gathering how a trained assassin came through the window of the Luna's private chamber 8 months into her pregnancy. I would invite Lord Cassiel, who is standing at her shoulder, to explain what he told us in the Ashenvale War Room 2 nights ago about his role in facilitating her access to the palace network. She paused. I would also invite any lord in this room who received correspondence from Cassiel's network over the past 4 years regarding the management of the northern territories to consider very carefully what they say next. The hall erupted. Not a controlled eruption. The specific human noise of a large number of powerful people all having very different reactions at very high speed, voices overlapping, the sound of several ongoing certainties collapsing at once. Veressa's face had gone still. Not frightened, still. The stillness of a woman calculating, and Seraphine recognized it because she had been calculating in exactly that way for 4 years. And the specific quality of Veressa's stillness now was the quality of a person who has identified that the ground under their position has gone and is determining whether there is anything left to stand on. She was going to do something. Seraphine had enough time to think that clearly before the hall doors burst open. The sound that came through them was wrong in a way that took 2 seconds to identify, and then was unmistakable. The specific percussion of armed conflict very close by, the voices of soldiers, and the ring of steel, not distant, not a border skirmish, immediate, outside the hall. One of Seraphine's guards appeared in the doorway, blood on his face, breathing hard. Edric's men, he said. He moved. He's got the city. The hall went into chaos, and in the center of it, in the middle of the assembled Alpha Lords and their shouting retinues and the crash of the doors and the sound of steel outside, Seraphine felt Kalen take her hand. She looked down at him. He was looking at the door, steady, tracking the sounds the same way she was tracking them, measuring the distance and direction and what it meant. Stay with Riva, she said. I know, he said. She looked up at Veressa across the chaos of the hall. Veressa was looking back at her. and in her hand, Veressa held the document she had taken from the jewel box. She raised it so Seraphine could see it, and even across the distance and the noise, Seraphine could read the seal on it, could read the specific wax crest pressed into the bottom of the page. It was Draven's seal, from 4 years ago. The order, signed in Draven's hand, that had formally stripped Seraphine of her position and sent her into exile. And beneath it, in writing Seraphine had never seen but recognized the hand from documents she had read in the war room, an addendum that would make the assembled lords believe the order had come not from Veressa's manipulation, but from Seraphine's own request. Forged. Forged well enough that it would take time to disprove, and time was the one thing that Edric's men in the streets of Vethmark were specifically designed to eliminate. "You want the throne," Veressa said, across the chaos, loud enough that the closest lords could hear her. "Prove it's yours." Outside, the city burned. The hall did not stop being chaos because someone controlled it. It stopped because Kaelin let go of her hand and walked to the center of the room. He did not shout. He did not raise his arms. He was 4 years old, and he walked to the center of the gathering hall with the deliberate, unhurried movement of someone who had decided that the noise around him was not a reason to change his pace. And something about the sight of it, the specific stillness of a small figure moving through the roar of 6 Alpha Lords and their retinues and the sound of steel outside the doors, pulled the room's attention the way a single lamp pulls the eye in a dark field. The noise dropped. Not all the way, but enough. Kaelin looked around the hall. He looked at the lords one by one, the same thorough inventory he gave every new terrain he entered. Then he looked at the doors where the sound of fighting was still coming through. And then he looked back at the room and he said, in a voice that carried in the way voices carry when everything else has gone quiet, and the speaker does not feel the need to shout, "If everyone fights now, who wins?" The hall was very still. Lord Brennan, who had been moderating alpha gatherings for 30 years and had seen most of what powerful people were capable of, looked at the boy for a long moment. "Nobody," Brennan said. "Nobody wins." "Then stop," Kaelin said. He looked at Draven. "Stop it." Draven had been moving towards Seraphine when the doors burst open. A tactical instinct. Get to the thing you are protecting, but the boy's voice stopped him, the same way it had stopped the room. He looked at his son. He looked at the 4-year-old who had just told him, in front of every Alpha Lord in the region, to stop a war. He turned to his guard captain. "Go," he said. "Northern Banner. Show them." The guard captain went. Seraphine had not moved. She was watching Veressa, who was still holding the document, and watching the calculation behind Veressa's eyes. The rapid reassessment of a woman whose carefully timed crisis had just been disrupted by a child asking a question that cut through the tactical architecture of the moment and exposed the thing underneath it, which was that nobody in this room actually wanted to be standing in a burning city deciding the future of an empire over a forged document. Nobody except Veressa. That was the distinction. That had always been the distinction. Seraphine walked toward her. Veressa did not move back. She held her ground in the white gown with the document raised, and her chin was level, and she had the specific composure of a person who has decided that if this is ending, it ends on their feet. Seraphine stopped 3 feet from her. "It's forged," Seraphine said. Quiet, just between them. "Prove it," Veressa said. Same register, private. The public performance had paused. "You already know I can. You've known for 2 days. That's why you called the gathering, because you needed the room full before I could build the case." Seraphine held her gaze. It didn't work. Veressa's jaw was tight. "You have no idea what it took to hold this kingdom together while you were playing warlord in the north." Seraphine looked at her for a moment. "You are going to stand in this hall," she said, "in front of every Alpha Lord in this region, and you are going to tell me that what you did to hold this kingdom together includes sending a man through my window with a knife while I was 8 months pregnant." Something crossed Veressa's face. Not guilt, not that. It was more complex than guilt, a thing that occupied the territory between justification and the place where justification stops working, where you have repeated the reasons to yourself enough times that you can feel them starting to go hollow. "I did not order that," Veressa said. "But you knew. Seraphine said. Cassiel told you, and you let the evidence stand. Veressa said nothing. Give me the document, Seraphine said. A long pause. The hall around them was still watching. The sound from outside had changed, the sharp percussion of active combat dropping into something less organized, less sustained, the sound of a force that has received a signal to stand down and is working out how to do that. Draven's banner was up. Veressa looked at the document in her hand. She looked at it the way a person looks at something they have been carrying for a long time when they are finally considering setting it down, not with relief but with the specific assessment of weight, the measurement of what you have been spending to hold it. She lowered her arm. She did not give Seraphine the document. She set it on the floor between them and stepped back. It was not surrender. It was a woman making a precise and final calculation about which things were still worth fighting for and which were finished, and executing that calculation with the same clean efficiency she had brought to everything else. Seraphine picked up the document. She did not look at it. She looked at Brennan. I am requesting a formal examination of this document by the gathering's record keepers, she said. I am also requesting that Lord Cassiel be held by this body pending investigation into the events of 4 years ago, specifically the assassination attempt on the Luna of Ashenvale and the subsequent falsification of council records. She looked around the hall at the assembled lords, the faces she had studied from a distance, the faces that had watched her kneel on marble and said nothing. I am aware that some of you received correspondence from Cassiel's network. I am not here to punish men for operating within the information they were given. I am here to establish what actually happened, on record, before this body, so that it cannot be revised again. Brennan looked at her for a long moment. The gathering accepts the request, he said. It took 4 hours. 4 hours in the gathering hall while the record keepers worked, and the testimony was given and the document was examined by 3 independent analysts who had no relationship to any party involved and who confirmed methodically that the addendum was forged, the ink inconsistent with the period, the hand a competent imitation but not the authentic article. Cassiel gave his testimony. He gave it standing, in the same controlled manner he had given everything for 20 years, and the content of it was the same as what he had said in the war room, stripped of the private edge, delivered for the record. He spoke about Veressa's approach. He spoke about his own calculation, the long view he had taken of Seraphine as a structural risk, the decision he had made and the methods he had facilitated. He did not minimize. He also did not perform remorse, which Seraphine found, in a complicated way, more credible than remorse would have been. When he finished, he looked at Seraphine across the hall. I said it wasn't personal, he said. That was the wrong word. What I meant was that it wasn't driven by feeling. A pause. I've spent 2 days considering whether that makes it better or worse. I have not resolved it. She looked at him. It makes it worse, she said. Hatred is at least honest. What you did was arithmetic. You put a person on a balance and decided their weight was inconvenient. She held his gaze. That is the kind of decision that ends empires. You were smart enough to know that. You made it anyway. He said nothing. She looked away. Veressa's testimony was shorter. She confirmed the Eastern correspondence, confirmed the relationship with Edric, declined to confirm the assassination attempt beyond acknowledging that she had known of it after the fact. Her voice was level throughout. Her face was level. She had retreated into some final interior composure that Seraphine recognized as the last defensible position, and she held it with the discipline she had always held everything. When it was done, Brennan called the formal assessment. The gathering found in favor of the legitimacy of the Ashenvale bloodline through Prince Kalen. It found the forged document inadmissible. It found Cassiel subject to formal investigation by an independent body. It found Edric's military movement in violation of the neutral ground provision and required immediate withdrawal. Edric withdrew. He had been waiting for the direction to run, and the gathering had just given it to him. His scouts pulled back from Vethmark before the session formally closed. Veressa was escorted from the hall. She walked out the same way she had walked into everything, straight-spined, controlled, the white gown catching the afternoon light from the high windows. She did not look back. Seraphine watched her go. She had thought sometimes in the north, in the long hours between tactical decisions, about what this moment would feel like, about the moment when it was finished, when the thing that had been done to her was formally and publicly undone. She had expected something large from it, some specific emotional event, the closing of a wound, the specific relief of weight set down. What she felt was quieter than that, not absence, not hollow, just the particular stillness of a landscape after a storm has moved through it. When the air is different, but you are still standing in the same place you were before it arrived. She had changed. That was the thing she hadn't fully accounted for, planning this from a mountain camp with a child asleep in the next room. She had planned for the resolution of external things, the empire, the territory, the record. She had not fully planned for the internal reckoning of standing in the room where she won and discovering that winning looked nothing like the picture she had carried of it. It looked like 4 hours of testimony in a cold stone hall. It looked like a forged document on the floor. It looked like a 4-year-old asking a room full of warlords a question so simple it cut through everything. It looked like work that was not yet finished. They stayed in Veithmark for 2 more days while the formal records were completed, and the gathering's findings were sealed and distributed to every territory in the region. On the second evening, Seraphine sat outside the staging camp on a low stone wall that looked west toward the city, where the buildings that had caught fire during Edric's brief occupation were still visible as dark smears against the last of the daylight, and Draven came and sat beside her. They sat in silence for a while. It was not comfortable silence. It was the silence of 2 people who have too much to say to start anywhere and have decided, mutually and without discussion, to let the silence do what it could before the words were required. Kaelin was asleep in the camp behind them. Riva was with him. "What happens now?" Draven said. Not a question, exactly. More the shape of the question, the outer edge of it, offered as an opening. Seraphine looked at the darkening sky. "I take the Northern Empire home," she said. "I have 6 clans in direct allegiance and 4 in cooperative structure, and I have been building governance infrastructure for 3 years that still needs another 2 years of work before it functions without me standing in the room." She paused. "That is what happens now for me." "And Ashenvale." "Ashenvale has a problem," she said. "It has a council that has been compromised at its core for years. It has border territories that were being sold to the Eastern Compact. It has a king who is a good man and a poor judge of the people closest to him, which is a specific kind of dangerous in a position that requires you to trust people." She felt him sit with that. "You know this." "Yes," he said. "The council needs to be rebuilt from the ground up. The border territories need renegotiation with Edric, who is going to be difficult and expensive but is ultimately more interested in trade than war, which is leverage." She looked at the city. "It is fixable. It will take years, and it will cost you things you have not anticipated yet." "I know," he said. She looked at him, the profile of him, the jaw that she saw every day on a 4-year-old face, the gray eyes looking west the same way she was. "I am not coming back to Ashenvale as Luna," she said. "Not cruel, just clear. The kind of clear that was the only honest thing available. That is not what I am. That is not what 4 years made me. I am the Iron Queen of the Northern Empire, and I have a sovereign obligation to the people who followed me when I had nothing but a letter opener and a plan that should not have worked." He was quiet. "I know," he said, a 3rd time. The specific repetition of a man who has known a thing for longer than he has been willing to say it. "Kaelin," she said. "Yes. He is going to know both of his parents. That is not something I am willing to negotiate." She held his gaze when he turned to look at her. "He will be with me. You will have access, real access, not managed visits. He will know Ashenvale, and he will know the North, and he will decide when he is old enough to decide what he is and where his obligation lies." A pause. "That is what I can give you." Draven looked at her for a long time. "It's more than I deserve," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." He exhaled, short, not hurt by the honesty of it, or if he was, absorbing it the way a person absorbs a clean wound, the specific willingness of someone who has decided that honesty at this point is the only available currency, and he has nothing left to spend but that. "I will fix Ashenvale," he said. "Not for you. Not for any external reason. His voice was quiet and very level. Because I let it break, and it is mine to repair. And because my son is going to grow up watching what I do with what I failed, and I will not give him a father who made a mistake and spent the rest of his life explaining why he never fixed it. She looked at him, the gray eyes that had once been the thing she trusted most in the world, the jaw that she saw on her son's face every morning, the man who had stood at a war room window for 4 years looking north and had finally, at significant cost to everyone involved, understood what he was looking at. She did not love him the way she had loved him. That version was gone, the way the version of herself that had knelt on marble was gone, and she did not grieve it because the things that replaced it were sturdier. They had been built in a wilderness and tested in a mountain pass and refined in 4 years of doing impossible things with inadequate resources, and they did not require Draven's recognition to be real. But she looked at him sitting on the stone wall in the last of the daylight, and she thought, he will do it. He will fix it. Not perfectly, not without cost, not without the specific stumbling that people who are relearning how to judge the people around them always do. But he will do it. And that was not nothing. Go get some sleep, she said. He stood. He looked at her for a moment, the long, direct look of a man saying something without the words for it, and then he walked back toward the camp. She stayed on the wall. The sky went dark by degrees, the specific slow erasure of daylight in a northern latitude, long and gradual, the light holding longer than you expected and then going quietly. She sat with the quiet. She had spent 4 years with the plan always in front of her, the forward-facing calculation always running, the next step always being assembled even in sleep. She had not allowed herself in 4 years to simply sit in the dark and not be building anything. She allowed it now. She thought about Mira, the rope, the 200 silver marks kept separate in the household accounts because Mira had grown up in a border town and that was what you did. She thought about Hessa, the healer, who had attended her birth in a cold stone room with the competent quiet of someone who had made peace with the specific math of hard work. She thought about Bram, 3 fingers gone to a wolf bite, who had looked at a 2-year-old with dark hair and decided that this particular child was worth teaching to track. She had not built the empire alone. She had built it from the accumulated acts of people who had looked at her circumstances and decided to be useful instead of cautious, and she had never been able to repay that properly. And she had carried the weight of it in the specific way you carry gratitude when there is no sufficient gesture for it. She would build something that lasted. That was the only repayment, not a monument, not an acknowledgement, but the sustained, difficult work of making something that made those acts of generosity mean something in the long run. That was the obligation she carried, heavier than the crown and more permanent than any formal title. She heard small footsteps behind her. She turned. Kalen was standing at the edge of the camp in his sleeping clothes, bare feet on the cold ground, dark hair loose, looking at her with the gray eyes that saw everything. "You're supposed to be asleep," she said. "I know," he said. "I woke up." She moved over on the wall. He crossed the ground and climbed up beside her, which took some effort given the height relative to his legs, and settled in with the unself-conscious ease of a child who has been climbing things since before he was strictly old enough to do it safely. He sat close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. They looked at the dark city together for a while. "Is it done?" he said. She thought about that. "The big part," she said. "Yes." "What's left?" "The long part," she said. "The part that doesn't have an end, governing, building, making sure the people who followed me have what they were promised." She looked at the sky. "That part doesn't finish. You just keep doing it." He leaned against her arm. She put her arm around him. "Is that good?" he said. "That it doesn't finish." She thought about the mountain pass, the cold room in Iron Fang, the rope Mira had packed, the letter opener, the 200 silver marks, the plan that should not have worked. "Yes," she said. "That's the good part." He was quiet for a while. She felt him thinking, the specific quality of his silence when his mind was working. "He's going to try," Kalen said. "Draven." "I know," she said. "I think he means it." "I think so too." Another pause. "Is that enough?" She looked at the dark horizon where the northern mountains were invisible but present, out there beyond the distance, the territory she had built out of nothing, the empire that had a name now, the people who had followed her when following her required more faith than evidence. Meaning, it is where it starts, she said. What comes after that is just work. Kalen considered this with the gravity he brought to everything that mattered. Then he said quietly, the way he said the things he had thought about for a long time before saying them, I'm glad you came back. She held him closer. Me too, she said. The night settled around them, cold and clear and very large, the way northern nights were large, the kind of dark that did not press down but opened up, the kind that made the world feel bigger than the specific weight of what you had been carrying through it. She had left this land with bleeding hands and nothing. She had come back carrying everything she had built, everything she had survived, everything she had refused to become, and everything she had chosen to be instead. And she had laid it down in the only room that mattered and said, this is what happened, and this is who I am, and this is what comes next. The empire was not restored, it was remade. From different material, built on different ground, governed by different principles, and it belonged not to whoever held the loudest claim or swung the most effective blade, but to everyone who had looked at the wilderness and decided to build something in it anyway. That was the empire. That was always the empire. She sat on the stone wall with her son warm against her side and watched the stars come out over the northern horizon, one by one, the way everything worth having comes. Not all at once, not guaranteed, but persistent and real and entirely unwilling to be extinguished. The alpha who took her crown lost an empire. The queen he could not break came back and built a better one. And she did not build it from vengeance. She built it from everything they believed she didn't have.